I'm been very concerned lately about China and sort of we have transferred so much money from our economy over to China by buying all those things and supporting their economy over there so they could make more and more money. They are now all over Africa, buying things and investing over there and getting those countries dependent on them and supporting, non-democratic people. And I'm just
like
wondering,
whom?
Well,
we are in a country that supports Saudi Arabia.
Yes, that's true. Right.
So suddenly we have a problem with, superpowers supporting non-democratic people?
Yes, yes, I do, but I also am just concerned that we've sort of created the economic power that China sort of has now, and they're using it, I fear, going to be using it against us eventually and against the better interests of a lot of people.
Allow me to put your mind to rest.
Okay, great.
You shouldn't worry about that.
Okay.
It's very simple. And let me explain why you shouldn't worry about that. But please continue.
Well, they're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port harbors.
And what's wrong with that?
And because
countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on. I know it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's
horrible
not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So.
Let me give you an example. Of course, they are peddling for influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they are non-interventionist. Absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom.
But I have a feeling they have a longer-term thought process that is more interventionist.
All right. But
anyway,
let's judge what we see. Let's judge what.
Okay.
Well, let's start at the beginning. The Chinese never asked Apple to go to Shenzhen and produce all the iPhones. It was Steve Jobs that decided that. Yeah? Mm-hmm. It was not China that went to Washington, D.C. and demanded that they buy a third of your national debt. If they hadn't bought it, you would be in serious trouble. Mm-hmm. Okay. Number 3. I did allude to this in my talk. If in 2008 China had not cranked up their credit bubble, you would be in a new Great Depression now. Mm-hmm. So, China, the United States, and the European Union are absolutely synergistic, and they need one another in a way that if we fail to acknowledge and to nurture, billions of people, including the majority of the people in this country, are going to suffer. Now, I am not going to stand here and defend China and the Chinese Communist Party. I already made some negative remarks about the Chinese Communist Party in referring to, their attitudes as being compatible with those of Wolfgang Schäuble. My concern about China is the authoritarian manner in which the Chinese regime is treating the Chinese people. As a Democrat, I have a problem with this. Mind you, I have to tell you that, from my understanding of China, it's a very interesting social experiment, in the sense that at the local level, or the regional level, you now have a boisterous democracy. At the local and regional level. Even with popular success stories in overthrowing local authorities, local bureaucrats who have been corrupt, who have been this, who have been that, who have been the other. When it comes to the influence of China outside its borders, I have to say, firstly, it's quite remarkable that they don't seem to have any military ambitions. Secondly, Africa. I'll give you an example, a specific example. Ethiopia. 2004, because I happened to be there, and I have some first-hand experience of it. They went into Ethiopia. I'll tell you why they went into Ethiopia, because they suspected there was oil. Because China is a major industrial power, but it lacks primary resources. Now, instead of going into Africa with troops, colonially, destroying the country, killing people like the West has done for the last 100 years, what they did was they went to Addis Ababa and they said to the government, we would like, we can see you have problems with your infrastructure, we would like to build some new airports, upgrade your railway system, create a telephone system, and rebuild your roads. And we'll do this all for free. No strings attached. We don't want anything from you. And they did. Why did they do it? Because this is soft power. Because because they knew that if oil is discovered, and it was discovered later, then, of course, the Ethiopian government will be much more open to Chinese oil companies coming there. They have never combined their investment with imperialistic view. When I was Minister of Finance, I had a very interesting experience with COSCO, one of the Chinese national companies that in the end bought the port of Piraeus. When I moved into the ministry, I found a contract from the previous government that they had already sold the port of Piraeus for a pittance and other ridiculous conditions to the Chinese, under the guidance, of course, of the European Union and the International Monetary Fund as well. And in other words, as the minister, I was bound to a particular deal that was terrible for Greece. And I went to the Chinese and discussed it with them. And I was really astonished. I said to them, look, you're paying too little, you're not committing to a sufficient level of investment, and you are treating our workers as fodder. You are effectively subcontracting labor to horrible companies that exploit the workers, and I can't deal with this. Effectively, I proposed to them to renegotiate the contract. So instead of getting 67% of the shares of the port, they would get with the same price 51. The remaining shares would go into the Greek pension fund system in order to bolster the capitalization of the public pensions. Secondly, I want you to commit to 180 million euros of investment within 12 months. And thirdly, proper collective bargaining with the trade unions and no subcontracting of labor. And to my astonishment, they said, okay. Can you imagine if that was a German company or an American company? That's why I'm saying I don't think you should worry.
Okay, I won't.
Now to Hong Kong once again. You know, Hong Kong continues to be at the center of the world's focus, but yet, and almost ironically in a sense, right, China has been playing it extremely coy when it comes to Hong Kong, almost like hands off when it comes to its very own territory, right? China sits back, allowing protesters to do what most countries, including our own, would consider unacceptable were something like that to happen here. So what gives with Hong Kong? Joining us now is Richard Wolff. He is a professor of economics. He's also the founder of Democracy at Work, and you can catch him on the Economic Report, which is extremely popular. I listened to it myself, and I recommend that you might want to do that. Professor, let me start with something that our own Michelle Greenstein reported here on RT last week. Fascinating report that unveils how the youth of Hong Kong are very anti-China, almost see themselves as Westerners, and have been indoctrinated over the last decade to be that way. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that, you know, the history teaches the lesson here. For 99 years, basically the 20th century, Hong Kong was a property and part of Great Britain. The British had imposed on a weak China, back at the time of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 or so, the imposition of a colony, the Hong Kong colony, owned and operated by the British as a place for British trade and investment and banking, and the Chinese had no say in it. It was as if a part of China, Hong Kong is part of China geographically and historically, was taken away from the Chinese and taken over by the British for a century. And it was a century of teaching the people there that even if their history was Chinese, they were now part of the West, part of capitalism, part of Britain, and developing the tastes for all that goes with that, the incomes that go with that, the level of consumption, and all the rest. Now we fast forward. The lease, the 99-year lease imposed on China is over, and suddenly Hong Kong reverts to China. Those were the terms of the lease, and now the Chinese and the Hong Kong people have to work out how to live together after a century of forced separation. No question that is producing glitches. It has in the past. The people in Hong Kong want to keep what they got from the British in the way of standards of living and income. The Chinese want to integrate them back into the whole of China, which is why you get these peculiar attitudes. They've been limping along pretty well, but what you see now is an explosion of built-up upset, partly political and partly this cultural notion we want to live in a different place because of where Hong Kong has been.
Is there a possibility, and especially given that they wanted, I mean, what was their big cry was this extradition bill is unfair. So now China says, okay, the extradition bill is gone. We've removed it completely, and yet the protests, not only do they continue, but they intensify and almost become more aggressive. How do you explain that?
Well, I think there are multiple things going on and conflicts among the people that are rebelling. Sure, some of them wanted that extradition bill canceled, but that was quickly solved. Some of them want more civil liberties compared to what is the rule in China. That can be accommodated too. But there were two things that some, not all, but some of the protesters clearly wanted. First, they made a march to the British embassy saying, we want to go back and be part of Britain. Then another group marched to the U.S. embassy and said the same thing about the U.S. The minute that happened, the people of Hong Kong set themselves over against the people of China. And therein lies the problem, because Hong Kong needs China way more than China needs Hong Kong. That's an unequal struggle. And as long as the Chinese think that the people of Hong Kong want to pull away again, the more intractable this conflict will be.
Professor Richard Wolff, we thank you, as usual, for joining us in this conversation about this extremely important topic. So you haven't heard that we're the ones covering the stories that you won't see covered anywhere else? In Venezuela, Kazakhstan, let's go to Hong Kong. And the media reaction to that has been crickets. How about the way we cover those stories? What the hell does that mean? Wally, Wally, Wally. That's the key word in this case, uprising. Keep? Can you believe that? Watching. This is the right thing for members of the media to do, to actually pick sides. Look, if you like what you see, subscribe.
To talk more about misinformation in the media, we're joined by journalist and author Max Blumenthal, the founder and editor of The Grey Zone. Max, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
This coronavirus outbreak has spawned a whole new wave of conspiracy theories. It seems almost every day there's a new one. And one can understand this getting onto social media because those are largely unregulated platforms. But now we're seeing it creep into mainstream media, into some big marquee titles. What do you make of that?
Well, I especially want to thank you for having me on, because no U.S. network, no independent U.S. network will have me on to debunk this conspiracy theory, which is being rolled out in mainstream media and pushed by the Trump administration, specifically by Mike Pompeo's State Department. It seems that no debate is allowed when the U.S. regime change elite wants to roll out a conspiracy theory. But if a Chinese official, for example, the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, introduces one about the virus escaping from Fort Detrick, all hell breaks loose, and U.S. media is filled with condemnations. At the Gray Zone, I, along with my colleague Ajit Singh, really methodically debunked this conspiracy theory. And what we showed was, first of all, that it was first kind of tested through a trial balloon in the right-wing Washington Times, owned by the South Korean Unification Church, and debunked at the time by the Washington Post, along with a scientific consensus. And you have scientists from across the West in Nature magazine declaring absolutely definitively that this could not have escaped from a lab. COVID-19 could have not have escaped from a lab or been the product of lab manufacturing. Lancet magazine, 27 scientists saying the same thing. But then it came roaring back with a vengeance in April as the Trump administration was grappling with 40,000 deaths on its hands in the U.S., seeking to point the finger at China. And it turned to a neoconservative columnist in the Washington Post opinion section, Josh Rogin, at the same newspaper that had originally debunked the theory. The State Department supplied cables, which Rogin proceeded to spin, claiming that there were safety issues at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and suggesting through various sleights of hand that the virus could have escaped from the lab. And then his story was shared by leading lights of the liberal media, of the Democratic establishment. This was on April 14th. And the following day, it comes out on Fox News in coordinated fashion. And then the Trump administration begins to saber rattle at China, blaming it for all 40,000 deaths in the U.S. So that's how this conspiracy theory was revived. And it's still out there. It's still alive in the ether with very little debunking or debate.
Yeah, you mentioned it came out on Fox News, and I'm wondering how much coordination there is between some politicians and news outlets, because there was a Republican politician who blamed China for the outbreak, and on that very same night, Fox was broadcasting this report saying that the virus came from a laboratory.
Yeah, that was Senator Tom Cotton, who is really the kind of pet project of the neoconservative movement. And he was really propped up by the billionaires behind the neoconservative movement, Paul Singer, Sheldon Adelson, to lead Trump's maximum pressure policy on Iran. But now that the new Cold War is turning towards China, Tom Cotton is leading the charge there as well. And so in the morning, Brett Baer, who's a correspondent at Fox News, rolls out a evidence-free story insinuating that COVID-19 escaped from the Wuhan Institutes of Virology. He cites official U.S. sources, doesn't name them, says they have proof, but he has himself not seen it. And that night, Tom Cotton appears on Sean Hannity, the primetime Fox opinion show, and declares that China's responsible for every death. They have blood on their hands, and they have to pay the price. So this is obviously coordinated. And as I mentioned the day before, the Washington Post's columnist Josh Rogin, a neoconservative who previously worked at the Japanese embassy, who has hung out with, is close friends with Orion Strategies, the lobbying firm which has had the contract for Taiwan. He received the State Department cables from Mike Pompeo's State Department to insinuate that there were safety issues at the Wuhan lab. So this whole thing was coordinated by the Trump administration through the media, and then it comes back to hardliners like Tom Cotton. Then after Tom Cotton's spectacle on Fox News the following day, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, former CIA director, most militaristic member of the Trump administration, demands U.S. access to the Wuhan Institutes of Virology, pushing the conspiracy theory to a new level.
You know, there are so many echoes here, listening to you there, of what happened in the build-up to the Iraq War. In fact, in your piece, you compare this media onslaught with the one that tried to legitimize that Iraq War.
Yeah, Josh Rogin here played the role of Judith Miller. Judith Miller was the New York Times correspondent who basically was the cipher or the sort of human bulletin board for neoconservative propaganda about Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction, which provided the justification for the invasion of Iraq. They had derived that phony intelligence from a Iraqi defector named Curveball, who turned out to just basically be a paid asset who was lying. And Miller, through the New York Times, provided this neoconservative deception with the veneer of mainstream respectability. And it allowed the Bush administration, and specifically the neocon civilians in the Pentagon, to sell that story throughout the Beltway, including to Democrats. So you saw Hillary Clinton and Senator Joe Biden advancing the WMD lie on the Senate floor. And that's what's happened here with the Washington Post and Josh Rogin. And again, there's been no pushback. That's why we did what we did at the Gray Zone, methodically dismantling this conspiracy theory, and no U.S. network will allow us to come on and debunk it.
When you look at this kind of reporting, Max, I mean, what are the dangers in reporting this kind of, well, unhinged conspiracy theories?
Where we're hurtling full speed towards a new Cold War with a nuclear-armed, rising economic power that could quickly become a hot war. If anyone knows the history of the tension around Taiwan, anything could happen. The U.S. has, through the pivot to Asia, sought to encircle China with its navy and with military bases from Korea to Japan and elsewhere. So this is really a dangerous situation. And when you start accusing powerful new rival of essentially manufacturing a disease that's killing tens of thousands of Americans, you're not only kind of invoking a yellow peril in the U.S. where Asian Americans are being targeted with hate crimes, you're using extremely militaristic rhetoric that could lead toward world war. Obviously, that's not in the cards right now, but it's something every American should be concerned about. And then beyond that, you have an element in the national security state which is seeking to justify record defense spending at the expense of America's healthcare system, which is in a state of catastrophe right now, as the coronavirus crisis clearly reveals.
There was also some support for the Washington Post reporting from the Columbia Journalism Review. I mean, many people consider this to be a serious journal about the practice of journalism. Did that surprise you?
Yeah, the Columbia Journalism Review is supposed to be a media watchdog, and I would have thought that they would have blown this conspiracy theory out of the water. Of course, if this had been a conspiracy theory that advanced the Russian or Chinese narrative, they would have done so. But instead they wrote, one of their top editors wrote that Josh Rogin had produced some bombshell reporting. And it was obviously an intelligence plant that produced Josh Rogin's bogus reporting. It was obviously a State Department disinfo dump. But it wasn't just the Columbia Journalism Review. It was Chris Hayes, who's supposed to be the smart guy at MSNBC, who is sort of on the center left. It was Charles Blow, a vehemently anti-Trump New York Times columnist, who shared this phony story. I saw a BuzzFeed editor share it and declare that it's absolutely plausible that the virus could have escaped from a Chinese lab. And I just thought of the irony of the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury, England, where there was the Porton Downs lab right near the poisoning, and anyone who suggested that Novichok could have been produced or escaped from that lab was immediately not just dismissed, but blacklisted as a Russian propagandist. But they're doing the exact same thing.
Max, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, Doctor. I want to ask a question about Hong Kong. So many journalists have been saying that the movement is increasingly nationalist. It is to counteract the Chinese imperialism as they perceive. I wonder if you share this angle, and should we approach this unique nationalism by situating it in the global revival of right-wing nationalism?
First, I must say I'm not trying to squeeze out of it that sympathetic as I am towards the protest movement, from what I can tell you is that first, I am not, as some people accuse me, a conformist here. From what I know, some of you maybe know more about me in China than I do. I only know that about a year ago, I was informed that because I signed some letter of protest apropos the previous demonstrations there, and I signed the letter in defense of, this is most interesting thing now happening. I get information from friends there. You know, now Marxism is there officially again in. They are reprinting, distributing to students, Mao, Marx, Lenin. But it's better for you, I'm told, not to read these texts. Because some of my friends there then tried to follow Marx very naively, got connected with workers who are poisoned, and then they were arrested. And so my point is that my books disappeared from bookstores. Then now they are half back, I was told. But at the same time, students are afraid to quote me in their thesis. So my status is there in between. So of course I'm sympathetic to demonstrations and so on and so on. The only soft, you know, China is for me a mega problem, a mega tragedy. Look, I told this to, sorry that I was there, Jordan Peterson, when I was there. Namely, what I told him. Listen, when people say, oh, communism screwed up everything possible, I said, sorry, was there ever in the history of humanity more explosive economic development than in the last 40 years in China? So many people lifted out of poverty and so on. And that's the lesson for us Western leftists. We, in the 20th century, we hate the two things: wild, unbridled capitalist competition and strong authoritarian state. How the Chinese did it precisely by combining these two. You know. So I'm not glad about this. I'm just, so it's such a, what I just don't like, that's my only point of, I wouldn't say sympathy, but suspicion about China. You know, it's so easy to criticize China for something we are doing here in a little bit more subtle way. For example, you know, we all know those stories which are true, incidentally. How in China you have that, how do you call this, patriotic status or whatever. Each of the citizens gets a point. If you pay debt, if you are a dissident, you lose points, all that stuff. Yeah, but we are also doing it just in a more, you know, just in a more subtle way, and so on, and so on. I think that we often use China, again, in a way to acquire safe distance towards something that we are also approaching too, and so on. So in this sense, I don't have any problems criticizing things in China. My pessimism is just this one. You know, maybe you know this story. I cannot tell you a guy who told this may bring him into trouble. A high-ranking Chinese philosopher told me that he knew the daughter of Deng Xiaoping. And she told him that when Deng Xiaoping was dying, some high functionaries visited him and asked him to kiss his ass, of course. The question, what was the greatest thing you did? They thought the answer will be opening up reforms. He said, no, that I resisted the temptation to go all the way and liberalize politics also. The tragedy is that it's horrible. I'm not glad to say this, but what if he was right? I think that at that point, after Tiananmen or before, to simply opt for political pluralism, I think it wouldn't end well. What does this mean? It's, I don't believe in this naive liberal vision. So what should we do? Should China be our model? No, absolutely not. But what do we have as an alternative, and so on and so on? So yes, I will protest, always sign protests for those in Hong Kong, although of course I was shocked when some of them then called Trump, save us from China, and so on. Wait a minute, be serious, and so on.